I know you're reading for us from your debut, The Temple of Persephone.
Yes.
Is there anything about the story or the scene that we should know before you jump into it?
Yes. So our heroine, Persephone Honeyfield, has just broken into Gallowsgate, which she believes to be abandoned, but is actually the estate of our hero, and he has just caught her there. So that's pretty much all we
Ooh,
need to know.
awesome.
Okay. So this is chapter 5 for anyone who's curious. Aidon had been sulking in the gallery when a noisy creak resounded through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway into the library. He had assumed it was Baker, accidentally bringing the tea tray to the wrong room. That was what he had expected to find, at least. What he hadn't expected was to see a woman at the top of the ladder that leaned against the shelves, reaching for a book. He also hadn't expected said book to be dropped right onto his head, but that was his fault for quietly approaching before announcing himself. Bending down, he picked the large volume up off the floor. The words mythology of ancient Greece were pressed into the dark green leather in intricate silver lettering. He turned to the woman, finally able to get a good look at her. The words that had been ready to leave his mouth were quickly lost as he took in the sight of her, hanging onto the rungs of the ladder and staring at him with brown eyes the size of saucers. She looked like a little forest nymph, clad in a white dress that appeared a little worse for wear. The hem was muddied, and parts of it were torn to pieces. His eyes slid up to her hair, so short that it may as well have been fashioned after a man's. It stuck out haphazardly in every direction, revealing a high forehead. The light that filtered through the window illuminated her, making her hair shine in shades of golden honey, and her skin glow with freckles that appeared to be composed entirely of sunlight. She stared down at him, eyes curious. The silence stretched on, an unreadable expression on her face. She remained high above him, knuckles white from her grip on the ladder. "I'm very sorry," she squeaked, making no move to descend. "Whatever for," he replied, despite knowing that she was technically trespassing on his property and therefore did owe him an apology. She raised an eyebrow. "For dropping the book on your head?" He looked down at the book and then back at her. "Of course." She was no conventional beauty, yet he was sure he'd never come across a more bewitching creature. "What does the cover say?" she demanded, squinting at the book he held in his hands. "Mythology of ancient Greece," he replied. She sighed. "That's not right." "It isn't?" She scaled down a few rungs and wedged herself against the ladder, making a seat out of it. Up close, he saw that everything about her was small, down to her delicate, slender fingers. She reached for the book with one hand, the back of which was dusted with freckles. Aidon wasn't quite sure how to put a name to the emotion coursing through him. Curiosity, confusion, or, and thinking this almost had him wincing outwardly in embarrassment, was it attraction? How long had it been since he'd been alone with a woman? "My name is Persephone," she said. Of course it was. He was hallucinating the physical embodiment of a goddess staring down at him with large, questioning eyes. He continued to study her small face, her slender neck, the unbearably luscious swell of her bosom, "And yours?" He lifted his eyes back to her face. "I beg your pardon? Your name?" "My apologies," he said quickly. He gave an awkward bow. "Aidon Barrington." "But you aren't supposed to be here," she said slowly, a frown marring her delicate features. "Aren't I? Gallowsgate belongs to my family," he said, feeling equal parts dazed and confused. Her dark eyebrows shot up. "Yes, but you don't live here, do you?" "No," he corrected quickly. "I live in London. I'm just visiting." "Oh," she exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. "I wouldn't have climbed into the window had I known anyone was here. Everyone in the village said this place was abandoned." "It is," he told her. "Well, partially, but what are you doing here?" This was his house, after all. The idea that any number of people might have climbed through the window over the last decade and gone through what was left of his family's possessions brought a twinge of discomfort and the urge to guard Gallowsgate from prying eyes. With Baker as its only guardian, Gallowsgate may very well have become an easy target for anyone curious to know what remained within its walls. Granted, the woman before him did not exactly give the impression of a thief, and if she was not a very good one. Persephone gave him a blank stare. "I'm looking for a book." "I gathered," he said wryly. "Why here? It's not often people go looking for books in abandoned houses. I have reason to believe what I'm looking for is here. I did not choose a random house to search through, I'll have you know." "No, of course not," he murmured, struck by the oddness of the exchange. "What book are you after exactly? Perhaps I can help." It was a ridiculous thing to say, given that he hadn't been to Gallowsgate in years and had absolutely no clue what books the library even held. It's called Mythology of the Greeks and Romans, she said, and Mythology of Ancient Greece won't suffice? No, it won't, she paused. It'll have the same stories, I'm sure, but it isn't what I'm looking for. He looked up at her. Do the mortals tell your tale correctly in books, Persephone? She hesitated, and he wondered if he'd overstepped. God, he was rusty. No, she replied, I'm afraid they do not. Is that so? For one, I was not dragged into the underworld kicking and screaming, she said mildly. He gave her a curious look. Persephone lifted her chin. I went of my own volition, and I was not tricked into eating those pomegranate seeds. I asked to have them. He chuckled. You wish to remain in the underworld? She nodded. The underworld needed a queen, and I needed a change from the monotony of spring. How fortunate for Hades that he was able to capture your heart. Color crept across her cheeks, and Aidon felt a thrill at having caused her to blush. That she had broken into Gallowsgate was already forgotten. I'm not quite sure he has, though I am certain I've captured his, she replied, eyes glittering mischievously before shifting back to the shelves that lined the wall. Would you help me? Find the book, I mean. Of course, he said, a touch too quickly. It belongs to my family, she blurted out, pushing Mythology of Ancient Greece back into its proper place. I'm not looking to steal anything from you. You'd be welcome to it either way, he said, hoping he sounded polite instead of desperately foolish. I'm not really one for books. That's a shame, she said, looking down at him. Perhaps you ought to try something new. It was not what she was referring to, but he had the distinct feeling that his something new was staring right at him. What would you recommend? Depends on what you've already read, she said, eyes scanning the room, and it depends on what you've enjoyed. You'll have to think on it. He was enjoying this. He hadn't enjoyed something so much in the 10 years since he'd taken on his father's business. Who knew that running into a strange wisp of a woman in his library would be just the thing to bring him back to life? Suddenly intent on pleasing her, Aidon began to look through the shelves, hunting for the book she was so desperate to find. They searched in perfect silence, occasionally checking in with one another until Persephone let out a long, exasperated sigh from the ladder, which now sat 2 bookshelves down from where it had originally been propped. Where is it? She grumbled. I doubt I'll get back before Venus and Papa now. Back? To Honeyfield, she explained. I live there with my sister and father. Honeyfield. When Ezra first mentioned it, it was as if Aidon had never heard the name at all. It had been so long since he thought of Oxbury at large. The only part that had lived on in his mind was Gallowsgate, isolated and oppressive. Nothing else had existed in his memories, mostly because nothing else had really mattered. His father had not allowed them to mix with the other families beyond going to the village, though a part of him vaguely recalled his mother receiving visitors while Charles had been away. Perhaps someone from Honeyfield. How else would the book have found its way here? The only thing he was certain of was that he and Persephone had never met. He would have remembered her. The honey, he murmured. My friend Ezra's at Honeyfield. Oh, she gasped, you know Mr. Haskett. We came here together. Why aren't you at Honeyfield then? She asked. Surely you've come for the same reason as Mr. Haskett. Not quite, he said. Only Ezra is here for honey. I'm here for a change of scenery. She nodded as if all had been clarified. I see. Well, I really should return. If you don't mind, I'll come back another time to look for the book, or you could let me know if you come across it. I doubt you'd want me back here tracking mud on your floors. He frowned. What could he do to keep her from leaving so soon? Stay for tea, he blurted out. I shouldn't, she said quietly, making her way down the ladder. He quickly approached her and offered his hand. She hesitated for a moment before slipping her delicate hand in his. Pure electricity shot through him at the contact, the force of it dizzyingly delicious. She had to have felt it too. What were the odds of their meeting? What were the odds of it being so perfect? Free from the wandering eyes of society, free from propriety, free from the presence of nosy gossips. Perfect didn't even begin to do it justice. At that moment, Persephone's boot caught the torn hem of her muddied white dress. A loud tearing sound cut through the room, and in less than a second, she had toppled off the ladder and straight into his arms, a large chunk of white muslin hanging pathetically onto the rest of her dress by a thread. He could feel the warmth of her, one hand against her back, the other having found purchase underneath her now bare knees. She blinked at him, cheeks crimson, the force of her heartbeat apparent even to him. I am so, she began, voice hoarse. Are you, he said precisely at the same time. Neither of them could complete their thoughts because, without any warning, Ezra burst into the room. He was accompanied by a tall elderly gentleman, a young woman with blonde curls, and a middle-aged couple who looked absolutely stricken. Oh, no, Persephone whispered, barely audible. She wiggled in his arms. Put me down. Aidon snapped out of his daze and slowly lowered her to the ground, clearing his throat. Ezra, I wasn't expecting you back so soon. I can see that, Ezra said cheerfully. Aidon shot him a look that made the smile disappear off Ezra's face. Everyone was curious to see Gallowsgate, Ezra explained. I thought we could have tea here before returning to Honeyfield for the rest of the demonstration. And it seems we arrived at the perfect moment, the middle-aged woman said, her horror seemingly forgotten as she began to practically vibrate with glee. There was no perfect moment, Mrs. Harding, Persephone corrected sharply. A lover's rendezvous, Mrs. Harding said in a loud stage whisper to the man next to her. Persephone, the blonde woman cried out, hands flying to her mouth. I was just, Persephone sighed in exasperation. I came here to look for the book, Venus. Venus's attention turned to Aidon, eyes widening as she examined him. Did you find it? No, Persephone said. In fact, I was about to return home. Such scandal, Mrs. Harding crowed, and in Oxbury too, and to have Miss Honeyfield in the center of it is simply— There is no scandal, Persephone protested. She looked up at Aidon pleadingly. Tell them there is no scandal. Miss Honeyfield is correct, he said, stepping forward. I was only assisting in her search for a book. Alone, Mr. Barrington? Mrs. Harding asked. It seemed he could not be free of gossips, not even in Oxbury. So much for the perfection of their encounter. Mr. Barrington, Venus said slowly, as if testing his name out. Aidon Barrington? Aren't you the Lord of the Dead? Excuse me, Persephone said, putting her hands on her hips. Aidon let out a long exhale, dread barreling through him. So he is, Mrs. Harding exclaimed. We heard all about it from Mrs. Murphy when she returned from London. Right, Persephone interrupted. I think we have taken far too much of Mr. Barrington's time already. We have not, however, been given sufficient explanation as to your activities here, Mrs. Harding insisted. Look at her dress. The poor thing's almost had it torn right off her. This time, Aidon saw that even Venus was casting a look of utter astonishment at the older woman. Mrs. Harding was hell-bent on conjuring a scandal out of this particular misunderstanding, and there was nothing anybody could do to stop her. Such an unfortunate situation your daughter has found herself in, Mr. Honeyfield, and with the Lord of the Dead, no less, Mrs. Harding continued with clearly feigned sympathy. Thank goodness your dear wife is not here to see this. Her eldest daughter ruined, she simply would not have been able to cope. Mrs. Harding, Venus chastised. Do not think you are unaffected by this, my dear, Mrs. Harding said, beady eyes darting to Venus. What gentleman would willingly marry into a family stained by such impropriety? Oh, what a waste of your beauty. The entire village was quite convinced you'd be the one to marry well. Surely you did not foresee being forced to remain at Honeyfield for the rest of your days with your ruined sister in tow. I shudder to think what will become of the two of you now. Venus's cheeks flushed crimson. I think we'll— Papa, Persephone interjected desperately, turning toward the thin man who had thus far been silent. There is no scandal to speak of, Mrs. Harding, Mr. Honeyfield said, his words measured and slow. This was not the way we wished to announce the news, but my daughter and Mr. Barrington are— He paused here as the entire room awaited his final word. Engaged. Aidon's mouth dropped open just as Persephone let an entirely unladylike curse slip from her lips. Ezra, meanwhile, gave Aidon a smug smile. And you said there was nothing to be found in Oxbury.